When I first started getting interested in epidemiology, I was actually interested and worked for the first 10 years or so of my career in occupational epidemiology. And you'll find a lot of people who've moved into environmental epi have had backgrounds in occupational epi. And so I started quite by chance. I got interested in occupational health and did a degree in an MSc degree in occupational safety and hygiene, health and safety, and was interested in research, and then fell into an opportunity which was a research fellowship in a study on the health risks for foundry workers. So my first major job, and that morphed into my PhD program, was a mortality study, a cohort study of foundry workers across the UK, steel foundry workers. Going back, right back to when I was a student, I was doing a general mixed science degree, doing some biology, some geology, physics, different stuff at university. And at that time I got, well, in the UK it was called Science for People. In the US there was a similar outfit called Science for the People, which was scientists interested in making their science more of relevance and use to the people. And I got particularly interested in one of the strands, which was to do with providing health and safety advice to workers who were baffled by the science that they were confronted with to do with occupational risks, particularly chemical risks. And that got me interested in occupational risks, and particularly chemical risks at work. And from that, I thought, oh, well, I'll do an MSc in that topic, which was occupational safety and health. And then it just happened that the professor who was running that program had negotiated a research project. They needed to hire a research assistant, and I happened to be there at the right time and applied and got the job. That got me very interested in the research into health risks, environmental health risks, in this case, the occupational environment. And from that job, it lasted several years. And then I wrote the thesis on the back of that research. And then whilst I was doing that, I then heard about and applied for another job, which was at IARC, in the International Agency of Research on Cancer. And that was looking at cancer risks, another kind of cohort study. That's how I got the job, because it was similar in structure to the cohort study of steel workers. That was a multi-country study of workers making man-made mineral fibers, glass wool and rock wool fibers, coordinated by IARC. And I worked on that for 3 or 4 years. And then after that, got involved in a couple of other international collaborations to do with silica and welders, yeah, so several other cohorts. At that time, I was doing occupational epidemiology, so I got involved in a sense, the sister organization, EPICO, the epidemiology section of ICO, the International Commission on Occupational Health. And it's very similar, whereas it's an organization of just several hundred people doing occupational epidemiology. So they were, the people, that was the annual meeting that I went to. So I continued working on occupational epidemiology. After working for a few years in France, I returned to England. I worked in Southampton for a while, then returned to Birmingham, and then got more involved in teaching. There was an MSc in occupational health and hygiene there that I was running for a time. The late 1980s, and at that time, funding opportunities in the UK and in Europe generally for occupational research was falling. And I think that was probably true in the United States as well at the time. And funding interest, this was following the global conferences on environment and sustainability. There was a sudden interest in environmental policy and controls, but also research. And so funding opportunities for environmental epidemiology rather than occupational epidemiology became more available. And so my next job came up while I was looking for new work, was in environmental epidemiology. And so I joined a new group studying environmental epidemiology. This was in London, in the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And so it was it was driven by the opportunity, looking for new jobs in better institutions than the one I'd been in before. And, they are driven by funding opportunities. And so I joined what, as I say, was quite a widespread phenomenon of people shifting from occupational to environmental epidemiology. Around 1980, I was involved in a bit of both occupational and environmental epidemiology. So for a couple of years, I tried to get to both EPICO occupational epi meetings and the ISEE environmental epi meetings. And then I more or less shifted, and I've been going most years to the ISEE meetings ever since that time. We didn't have regional chapters in Britain or Europe at that time. So yeah, it was once a year. So then I started getting into in applying for environmental grants, and I worked a bit on silica exposure, in fact, and that's how I got to know John Goldsmith. His son David was doing a lot of work on silica, and I also got to know kind of key individuals involved in ISEE through particularly the international links that I made through working in IARC. The studies I then got involved in environmentally were in particular air pollution studies and arsenic. I'd worked collaboratively on a number of EU-funded multi-country studies, one on rare diseases, one on occupational cancers, another one on infertility in relation to environmental and occupational exposures. So a number of outcomes related to comparing between different European countries. Then I applied for and led a study on arsenic and cancer across three different countries in Europe, and another one on air pollution and health in Eastern Europe. So those are both environmental exposures, one air and one water. I got involved as one of the science panel, the advisory group, who were investigating a big contamination around a DuPont plant in West Virginia, which was manufacturing Teflon and polluting the drinking water with a chemical that at that time I had not heard of. In fact, most people had not heard of. But now it's really kind of in the headlines almost every month now. It's PFAS, and there's even a Hollywood film with Mark Ruffalo about that particular court case and the lawyers who eventually prevailed, and there was a big settlement DuPont had to pay, uniquely because most of these court cases about toxic chemicals, if you think back to Erin Brockovich and those kind of cases, there are the competing sides, and you have expert witnesses, and depending on how many witnesses appear on each side, one side or other prevails and convinces the jury or the judge to settle one way or another. Whereas this was unique in the sense of they recognized that there was a lot of uncertainty in the data, and instead of just trying to pay as many experts on each side to make a decision based on that uncertain evidence, they said, well, let's get some more data. So some of the settlement money was diverted into doing research, and in fact we kind of managed to put together some key studies. It was the first big studies of a major exposed population on these particular chemicals. Studies up till now had been taking random sections of the population and measuring very low levels in the blood and linking them to different health effects, which is part of the story. But this was looking at clearly heavily exposed and non-exposed people. So you could really pin down that if you found an effect, and we found several effects, you can link it to that particular exposure. And I've been kind of swimming in PFAS ever since. I mean, that started in 2005. That's over 15 years ago, and I'm still working on projects to do with PFAS exposure at the moment in two big European populations who are exposed in Italy and in Sweden. In terms of ISEE, although half the membership is based in the US, it's always had a very clear program of trying to engage with a variety of people across the different regions. And so I got to know the ISEE coordinators, the leadership, in the context of attending these annual meetings. And then at a certain point, I can't remember if I was invited or I suggested, but anyway, I applied to compete to be on the council for one of the European places in the 90s. Once you get engaged and then you get involved in the committees and get to know the secretariat and everyone much better, then yeah, you become involved. So I got involved in a couple of specific committees, the ethics and philosophy committee and the policy committees in particular. I spent some time with, and then I co-organized one of the meetings. I was sort of half organizing the one that was hosted in Dublin. The role of president as an inward-looking component and outward-looking. Outward-looking, it's good to present the society to other organizations and go around giving lots of lectures to make the society more visible. People who already had a really major international profile when they were presidents would be very good at that. Tony McMichael, for example, was preeminent at being able to play that role of being an ambassador very much for the organization. I think during my tenure, I maybe it's an issue of confidence or whatever, but I was focused more on trying to help run the organization. I was particularly interested in trying to build up the participation and engagement of the regional chapters and the specific chapters as a way of, I suppose, engaging more people in active participation in the society, to bridge the gap between the annual meetings, because people could meet and network once a year. A good 800 or 9 or 1,000 people would get together, and that was a great opportunity. But in between that times, we were trying to find ways. That was my main focus at the time, was trying to encourage engagement and if you like, democratic participation of the membership in the organization, which is not sure how much progress happened in those particular years, but it's certainly it's much more the case now than I think it was in the years prior to that. Different countries sometimes take a rather anti-science position, in the sense of not taking seriously the sort of science that we produce. So the Trump regime in the US was hostile to environmental research or hostile to the EPA. ISEE did make some public pronouncements about that, contributed to the pressure to push back against that anti-science flavor. Individuals who valiantly battle against those kind of anti-science interests need our help. We have a whistleblower support mechanism which helps individuals, and we have an annual award for people who quite publicly risk their careers prevailing against attempts to suppress work, for example. We do engage in kind of reflection and producing documents about how our members, how our researchers in our community can deal with conflicts of interest, deal with pressure, how we can defend good quality science in a conflicting environment when there are people who want to prove one thing or another, and we have to battle against that with good methods and good independence.